Madam President, one citizen, one vote. Today, this foundational principle is under attack. It's under attack because President Biden refuses to enforce the law. And now we face a direct threat to our entire electoral system. Consider this. Since President Biden's inauguration on January 20th, 2021, over 10 million illegal immigrants have entered the United States. Now, this figure exceeds the populations of 36 states, creating a crisis that has been met with troubling silence and inaction from far too many on the other side of the aisle. With millions of unauthorized people now on U.S. soil, living here in the United States, the potential for election fraud through ineligible voting is not just a hypothetical risk. No, it is a looming reality. With the influx of non-citizens under this administration, even if just a fraction, let's just say something like 1 in 100 were to vote, this could translate to hundreds of thousands of votes, enough to sway our tightly contested elections and potentially alter their outcomes. This is deeply concerning, considering that a recent study showed that non-citizens have ample openings to vote illegally. It found that anywhere from 10 to 27% of non-citizens are registered to vote, and 5 to 13% of non-citizens do actually vote in presidential elections, no less. Across the nation, instances abound where states have inadvertently facilitated this very crisis. From unsolicited voter registration forms being mailed out to non-citizens, to driver's licenses issued without adequate checks, practices relying merely on the honesty of illegal aliens have opened up the floodgates to voter fraud. While it's true that it's already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections, there are no effective systems in place to verify the citizenship of voters. A mere check on a box is all it takes, with little risk of being caught. In short, you're on the honor system with those forms. Federal law even prohibits states from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters via federal forms. So it's not just that the states aren't doing an adequate job of verifying citizenship as a condition precedent to registering to a vote in a federal election. They're prohibited by law from doing so. An increasing number of localities permit non-citizens to vote in local elections. And this makes it even worse. It further blurs the distinctions that have historically been meant to protect the integrity of our elections. Prominent Democrats have openly discussed these tactics, in many instances, as beneficial to their agenda, as likely to help their political ambitions. Only months ago, every Senate Democrat voted to count illegal aliens in the census to help them shore up more seats in Congress and consequently more votes in the Electoral College. This cannot continue. It's our responsibility, our imperative, to close these gates. My bill, the SAVE Act, would ensure that this stops, because it would be a vital step in securing the electoral process, ensuring that every vote cast is legitimate and every voter is duly recognized and registered and properly brought into the system so that they can vote. The SAVE Act amends the National Voter Registration Act, the same act that was interpreted a few years ago by the Supreme Court as prohibiting the states from requesting any positive proof of citizenship, so that states could ensure that only U.S. citizens may participate in federal elections. It fixes the NVRA. If the NVRA was interpreted that way, this would close that loophole. The SAVE Act requires states to obtain concrete documentary proof of citizenship at the time of voter registration. It specifies acceptable documentation and requires states to establish alternatives alternative verification processes for those rare instances in which standard documents might be unavailable. Furthermore, the SAVE Act compels states to proactively remove non-citizens from voter rolls and introduces severe federal penalties for those who intentionally register non-citizens. This bill echoes the sentiments of the American people from coast to coast. It transcends political affiliations with an overwhelming bipartisan supermajority of Americans supporting it. And it speaks directly to the core of what makes our country great: fair, free, and secure elections operating within our constitutional republic. This is about protecting our elections from foreign interference, something my Democratic colleagues claim to care about and long have. If we truly want our elections to be free of foreign interference, then by all means, pass the SAVE Act. Let's pass it today. Let's pass it right now. So for those of my colleagues who are opposed to this, why aren't they concerned with the ability of tens of millions of foreign nationals, non-citizens in the United States, to vote in America? Why should we allow tens of millions of foreign nationals who are not citizens in the United States to vote in U.S. elections? Now, if the Biden administration insists on keeping America's border open, as to my great dismay, it has, for the entirety of the 3.5 years or so Biden's been in office, they're going to insist on keeping the borders open, then by all means, they must, at least at a bare minimum, ensure that none of those non-citizens are interfering in our elections. Every single day that we delay, the foundation of our electoral process erodes a little more. We cannot wait for this administration to enforce the law, to enforce the border, which they haven't done. They continue to refuse to do it. More people continue to enter. But in the meantime, they've let in 10 million illegal aliens. You add that to those who are already here, an estimated 30 million non-citizens currently reside in the United States. But this administration just keeps right on trucking, not doing anything about this problem. And in fact, this administration strongly opposes this legislation. Now, let's run through the reasoning. The reasoning is really telling. There are several arguments raised by the White House in the statement they issued just earlier this week. First, the White House protests, quote, "It is already illegal for non-citizens to vote in federal elections. It is a federal crime punishable by prison and fines," close quote. Now, to be clear, that is on its face a correct statement of the law. I won't disagree with the statement on its four corners, but the conclusion is really messed up. As I've already stated, there's absolutely no functioning mechanism for enforcing the law, and it's worse than that. It's not just that current law doesn't create an adequate enforcement mechanism. It's that current law, as interpreted by the Supreme Court, affirmatively prohibits the states from doing what they would need to do in order to prevent non-citizens from registering to vote and subsequently voting in federal elections, contrary to federal law. Meanwhile, DOJ investigations of illegal voting are all but non-existent. A law without enforcement cannot, will not stop illegal behavior. And there are many, many circumstances in which, notwithstanding the fact that the underlying conduct is criminally prohibited, you still need some sort of verification mechanism to make it enforceable. By the White House's own logic, it'd be unnecessary and perhaps even unwise to have laws requiring a photo ID to buy beer and cigarettes. You know, we've got these laws on the books, after all, that already make it a crime to sell beer and cigarettes to children. So according to the White House's logic, we shouldn't need an additional law requiring age verification with a photo ID. Now, nobody would be that crazy, that insane to make that argument there. We shouldn't be making it here. It's the same argument, the exact same argument. Next, in second position, the administration makes the unsubstantiated claim that, quote, the justification for the SAVE Act is based on easily disproven falsehoods, close quote, end of sentence. But then, well, the administration utterly fails, defiantly refuses to offer anything to support that statement. It's ironic because that justification for opposing it, on grounds that the justification for the SAVE Act is based on disproven falsehoods, this is its own disproven falsehood. There's nothing there. There's no falsehood that's been disproven. They have not disproven the fact that non-citizens, whether legally or illegally in this country at the time, can easily obtain a voter registration, eligibility to vote in federal elections, or the physical ability to do it, rather, so long as they're willing to check a box and sign their name. They don't dispute the fact that in all 50 states and D.C., a non-citizen can apply for and receive a driver's license, or that the National Voter Registration Act makes it easy when applying for a driver's license to check a box and sign your name and thereby register to vote in federal elections. When you add to that the fact that states are affirmatively legally prohibited based on the Supreme Court's interpretation of the NVRA a few years ago, saying that the states cannot, may not, must not ask for any kind of documentation to verify citizenship, we've got a problem. So for them to say that our justification for the SAVE Act is based on falsehoods, on easily disproven falsehoods, is itself easily disproven, and it's a falsehood. Third, the administration asserts that, quote, making a false claim of citizenship or unlawfully voting in an election is punishable by removal from the United States and a permanent bar to admission, close quote. Well, this is an interesting argument. This one is rich, Mr. President, coming from this administration. Look, well, it's true that the naturalization form has a self-reporting mechanism that asks the applicant if the applicant has ever voted illegally. Yeah, that's true. As far as I can tell, even when they do self-report, in those, I suspect, rare instances where they do, absolutely nothing has been done with that information under the Biden administration. Joe Biden isn't deporting anyone for illegally voting. Joe Biden has opened the floodgates and just lets people come in. So that's rich coming from this administration, suggesting that there's going to be suddenly rigorous enforcement of laws governing our border security. In this instance, when, number one, they're not doing it, and number two, everywhere you look, they're doing the opposite of that. Fourth, the administration asserts, quote, states already have effective safeguards in place to verify voters' eligibility and maintain the accuracy of voter rolls. Mr. President, that assertion is simply flat out wrong. It's just false. It's false factually and it's false legally, meaning it is not true and it cannot be true by operation of law for reasons I've just explained. States are legally prohibited from requiring proof of citizenship when registering voters for federal elections. This, I fear, may well be a feature, not a bug, for the administration, and a reason for the administration to oppose it, tragically. We'll get back to that more in a moment. But look, this loophole that I'm describing, based on the Supreme Court's interpretation of the NVRA, telling states that they may not and must not ask for any kind of evidence of citizenship, that's a gaping loophole that we must fix. Lastly, the administration claims that instead of safeguarding our elections, this bill, with its incredibly generous list of ways to demonstrate citizenship, would make it harder for Americans to vote. Well, look, the reality is that there's an expansive list of ways to demonstrate citizenship, even if you lack the documentation traditionally involved in proving it. And keep in mind, it's not unusual for Americans to be asked for proof of citizenship. Every single time an American citizen starts new employment, starts a new job, and they fill out an I-9, they've got to provide proof of citizenship. And if you're not a citizen, you've got to show evidence of your visa and your eligibility to work in the United States under that visa. If you can't do that, you can't start a job. This happens all the time. This is not as if the ability to prove citizenship and a requirement that one do so is foreign to us. Nor is it the case under this bill that it would be exceptionally difficult, because even if you're one of those rare individuals who, for whatever reason, doesn't have or have access to a birth certificate or something else that could prove it, we've got a long list of other ways that you can do it, even if you lack the traditionally utilized documentation. This bill allows all American citizens to vote. More importantly, if enacted, it would mean that no American vote could be canceled out by a vote cast illegally by a non-citizen. This bill would make it harder to cheat in elections and ensure the integrity of every ballot lawfully cast. There is no valid argument against the SAFE Act, Mr. President. None. The only reason to oppose this bill would exist if you needed illegal votes to win elections. Full stop, that's it. By passing the SAVE Act, we would send a clear message that in the United States of America, voting is not just a privilege of citizenship, but a cherished and protected right. As debates about election integrity rage, the SAVE Act stands out by guaranteeing that only American citizens can have a say in our elections. American elections must be decided by American voters, full stop. And so, Mr. President, as if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 8281, which is at the desk. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Reserving the right to object.
The senator from California.
Mr. President, I ask you this. How many times do we have to go through this? Less than 2 months ago, I came down to the floor of the Senate to object to this very same bill, expressing concerns, asking questions, and here we are again, and nothing has changed. So it doesn't matter how many times this bill comes to the floor. It doesn't matter how many times our Republican colleagues feign outrage over non-citizens unlawfully voting without a shred of evidence. It doesn't change the fact that as good as the proponents may make this bill sound or try to make this bill sound, it is nothing other than a solution in search of a problem. Now, I speak both as a senator representing California, but also as a former chief elections officer of California, where I, as the secretaries of state across the country, by the way, worked alongside tireless election clerks and administrators across the political spectrum at the state and local level. And given that experience, I can tell you this: there is no credible evidence of a meaningful number of non-citizens voting in our elections. In 2016, audits showed that non-citizens accounted for 0.0001% of the vote. Even the conservative Cato Institute has said that, quote, non-citizens don't illegally vote in detectable numbers, end quote. And I'm glad Senator Lee mentions the National Voter Registration Act because, as he pointed out, it was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in terms of its guidance of what states can and should do and what they cannot do. He also didn't mention that the National Voter Registration Act was adopted on an overwhelming bipartisan vote of Congress. But rather than propose legislation based on facts, this bill would respond to the alarming allegations that Republicans themselves have fabricated. It would create more barriers to exercising the right to vote and would restrict ballot access for even more Americans than is currently the case. It would make voting harder for the more than 21 million eligible voters in America who can't easily access their proof of citizenship. I don't know about you, I'm not in the habit of carrying around my birth certificate or even my passport. Not everybody has a passport. Doesn't mean you're not a citizen if you don't carry a passport. And I'm not just talking about Democrats or Republicans, I'm talking about Americans of both political parties. The bill would clearly also disproportionately impact voters and communities of color. In addition, this bill seeks to undermine faith in our elections by injecting fear and uncertainty, particularly in an election cycle at a time when our democracy demands more calm and understanding of the integrity of the process. But Senator Lee and I agree on one thing, believe it or not, and that is voting is a sacred responsibility, and the right to vote in and of itself is fundamentally sacred. So to my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, if you're truly worried about the election and our democracy, then I ask you this: join me. Join me in passing the Freedom to Vote Act and making sure that all eligible Americans, yes, only United States citizens, can make their voices heard at the ballot box without any unnecessary barriers or obstacles. It's the most American and the most bipartisan thing that we could do. But until then, let's be honest with the American people. So yes, Mr. President, I object.
Mr.
The
President.
objection is heard.
Mr. President.
The senator from Utah.
I appreciate how the presiding officer always speaks loud enough so that everyone can hear, and the presiding officer also manages the floor with great assertiveness, which I also appreciate. I'm grateful to my friend and colleague, this distinguished senator, my colleague from California, and his thoughtful approach to legislation. There are some things that he said that I feel that I need to address. One of them is a reference to a belief that there is no credible evidence of non-citizens voting, at least no credible evidence of non-citizens voting in any significant numbers. Well, there are studies that go exactly the opposite direction, studies like the one that I cited just moments ago, showing that it is a non-trivial sum, such that if even something at the low end of the percentages cited in that study were correct, that could easily be enough to sway the outcome of some elections. But regardless, what my friend is referring to has to be taken with a grain of salt, considering how things have changed on the ground. The numerator and the denominator of that fraction have changed over the last few years, where we've now got about 30 million non-citizens living in the United States, with about 10 million who have come in who are illegally in the United States now, who entered this country unlawfully and are now living in the United States. That is not a non-trivial sum. When that many people enter the United States that quickly, and when you've now got all 50 states and D.C. issue driver's licenses to non-citizens. That, coupled with the National Voter Registration Act and the way the National Voter Registration Act was interpreted a few years ago by the Supreme Court of the United States, saying that the state officials who processed those federal forms submitted under the NVRA so that people can register to vote in federal elections while applying for their driver's license, that creates a toxic soup in which there's an environment just ripe with opportunities for foreign interference in U.S. elections. You cannot add this many non-citizens, legal or illegal non-citizens to the United States in this short of a period of time, and couple it with that kind of voter registration framework, and not anticipate that there will be significant numbers of people who will end up registering to vote. Some perhaps somewhat innocently, perhaps others less innocently, I don't know. But it would be supremely naive, and worse than that, willfully blind to what we all know is going to happen unless we pass this. Now, the House of Representatives passed this bill yesterday, which gets to another point made by my colleagues, saying that we've been down here over and over and over again doing this bill. I'm not sure what he's referring to. The bill hasn't even been around that long, but something material changed yesterday. Yesterday, the House version of the SAVE Act, which is the version that I'm coming to the floor today to propose, the one that I just tried to pass by unanimous consent moments ago before it was met with the objection of the senator from California. That bill was passed yesterday, less than 24 hours ago, by the House of Representatives, with bipartisan support, I would add. Not just Republicans over there, some Democrats who are concerned with very good reason joined with Republicans in order to get this thing passed. So, to say that this is an area in which there's no credible evidence of any need to act is science fiction fantasy. It is contrary to fact, it is contrary to logic, it is contrary to our understanding of human nature, contrary to our understanding of the National Voter Registration Act and how it's been interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States, and how elections work. As to my colleague's suggestion that this is feigned outrage that's animating this, nothing could be further from the truth. Look, I wish this could be feigned. I wish I had the luxury of this being something that were feigned. Mr. President, this is serious business. We lose something. We lose something as Americans anytime certainly anytime we allow our elections to be vulnerable to interference from forces outside the United States, including foreign nationals, non-U.S. citizens, inside this country. When that happens, when the public starts to perceive that others are voting in this, diluting their votes, that has deleterious effects on the effective operation of our Republican form of government that are very difficult to recapture once they're lost. We can't treat this casually. And so, look, I will be back. It's unfortunate that we weren't able to pass this today. Let me restate the point I made earlier. There is not a legitimate reason to oppose this bill. We make it incredibly easy under this bill for any American. If you are an American citizen, you can easily prove your citizenship. And you can do it in the way this bill requires, and you can still vote. It is not hard, it is not expensive, it need not require anyone to spend a dime, a nickel, or even a penny. It just requires you to be an American. There is not a legitimate reason to oppose this bill. There is not a logical reason to oppose this bill, unless, of course, your objective is different, unless, of course, you are just fine with and in fact, excited about or reliant upon non-citizens voting. That's alarming. Thank you, Mr. President.